The ship has been at anchor for less than 6 hours, and the money is already moving. The year is 1716. Nassau, in the Bahamas, is loud with the kind of noise that follows a successful raid. Men who spent weeks on a crowded, leaking sloop are now on solid ground, and they are not thinking about hiding anything. They are thinking about spending it. The hold of the captured prize contains sugar, tobacco, bolts of cloth, some tools, a small amount of coin, and several barrels of salted meat. Not a chest of gold, not a pile of jewels. A collection of perishable, bulky, and legally compromised goods that had to be converted into usable money before any of it was worth a damn. You can't bury sugar. You can't drink tobacco. Every piece of stolen cargo came with a clock attached, and the clock was already running the moment the raid ended. The men who took it had no warehouses, no banking accounts, no land holdings, and no legal standing in any court in the Atlantic world. What they had was a ship in a harbor, a hold full of goods, and a very narrow window of time before somebody more powerful than them showed up and took everything away. Welcome to Dead Man's Shore. I'm Jack. If you're new here, we dig into the real history behind pirate life, not the Hollywood version. Hit subscribe if you want more, and drop a comment below telling me whether you think you could have survived a pirate crew's money system for even 1 month. You know the image. A chest of gold coins buried on a remote island under a palm tree, with a hand-drawn map to follow later. The captain fills his cabin with riches and keeps it all until retirement. The crew swims in plunder. Everybody gets rich and disappears into a comfortable exile somewhere warm. It is a clean story. It is also almost entirely wrong. Robert Louis Stevenson did more damage to the real history of pirate finance than almost any naval battle ever did. His novel, Treasure Island, published in 1883, gave the world the buried chest, the dotted map, and the idea that pirates were sitting on permanent hoards of hidden wealth. The problem is that Stevenson was writing adventure fiction, not maritime history, and the real economics of piracy in the Golden Age were almost the exact opposite of what that image suggests. Most pirates were not wealthy men who chose the life for adventure. Most of them were former sailors, fishermen, unemployed soldiers, and indentured servants who entered piracy because the alternative was starvation, naval impressment, or a brutal work contract in a colonial port. They came from the bottom of the maritime economy, and most of them died without accumulating any significant lasting wealth at all. The ones who did manage to hold on to money for a while were the exception, not the rule, and even they faced a set of practical problems that made long-term wealth almost impossible to maintain. So let's start with the actual problem. When a pirate crew took a prize, what they usually captured was cargo. Not gold, not jewelry, not a hold full of coins. Cargo. In the Atlantic and Caribbean during the early 1700s, that meant sugar, tobacco, indigo dye, raw cotton, spices, bolts of cloth, barrels of rum, barrels of wine, barrels of salted fish or meat, tools, ropes, timber, tar, ship fittings, weapons, gunpowder, and whatever personal possessions the captured crew happened to be carrying. Sometimes there were coins. Sometimes a captured merchant had something valuable locked in a chest in his cabin. But the bulk of any prize, almost every single time, was perishable or bulky trade goods. Stolen cargo is not the same as money. To turn stolen cargo into money, you need a buyer. To find a buyer for stolen cargo, you need a market. To operate in a market, you need access, reputation, and secrecy. And to maintain any of those things while being hunted by every major naval power in the Atlantic world, you needed a system. a complicated, fragile, layered system that stretched from the ship's hold all the way to a tavern table in a port where the governor was looking the other way. At least, for now. Let's talk about the first layer, because it starts before the money even exists. When a pirate crew set out on a voyage, most serious crews signed articles, written documents. These were not romantic declarations of pirate freedom. They were practical labor contracts, closer in spirit to a merchant ship's articles of agreement than to anything you'd see in a movie. The articles written by Bartholomew Roberts have survived in the historical record, documented in Captain Charles Johnson's account from 1724. Roberts's articles covered the division of shares, rules against fighting between crew members on board, and compensation paid to any man who lost a limb or suffered a serious injury in action. That last item is worth pausing on. Pirates had written compensation schedules for injuries before most navies had anything comparable. Lose your right arm? Collect a set number of pieces of 8 from the shared fund. Lose an eye? Collect less. Shared risk, shared cost. Written down before anything happened. The articles mattered for the money system because they established the expectation of fairness before anyone had to argue over it. A crew that agreed on injury compensation before a voyage was less likely to descend into violence over prize shares afterward. The articles were not about freedom. They were about preventing the ship from destroying itself before it could reach port. Every captured prize was divided according to the articles. The captain received a larger share than ordinary crew, typically 2 shares, where a sailor received 1. The quartermaster, who handled the practical day-to-day running of the vessel and acted as a check on the captain's authority, received a share somewhere between the captain's and the crew's. Specialists like carpenters, surgeons, and gunners often received additional compensation because they were harder to replace. This was not charity. It was supply and demand built directly into the labor contract. But the prizes themselves had to be assessed and valued before any shares could be calculated. Who did the assessment? Usually the quartermaster, sometimes with a small elected committee. This meant that before a single coin changed hands, there was already a point of potential argument. Was this bolt of cloth worth 5 pounds or 3? Was this barrel of tobacco prime quality or middling? A wrong assessment meant a man walked away with less than he had earned after weeks at sea. And every man on that ship was armed, exhausted, and watching the assessment very carefully. The system worked not because everyone trusted each other, but because the articles created a shared framework that made open betrayal too costly to attempt, at least most of the time. The articles only solved the first layer of the problem. Once the shares were calculated, if the prize contained coin, the division was relatively straightforward. Count it, divide it, hand it over, done. But if the prize contained cargo, which it usually did, you could not divide a barrel of sugar into 120 equal pieces without turning it into a wet mess that nobody could sell. The cargo had to be sold intact, which meant it had to be sold together, which meant the money came later, and the men had to trust that it would arrive and be divided fairly. This is where the black market became essential. Pirate crews needed buyers who would purchase stolen goods without asking too many questions about where those goods had come from. In the Atlantic and Caribbean world of the early 1700s, these buyers were colonial merchants, tavern keepers, ship chandlers, and middlemen who operated in ports where local officials either looked the other way or were actively taking a cut of the profits. Nassau at its peak hosted something in the range of 1,000 to 2,000 men, depending on which ships were in port. Merchants from the American colonies sent ships to Nassau to buy captured cargo at discount prices and bring it back to Boston, Philadelphia, or Charleston, where it could be sold at a profit. The merchants knew the goods were stolen. They bought them anyway, because the price was right, and the risk fell mostly on the pirates, not the buyers. Here is where the money became more dangerous than the battle. The relationship between pirates and their buyers was never equal. The buyer was in a legally defensible position. He could claim ignorance, pay a fine, surrender the goods, and walk away. The pirate could not. If the deal went wrong, if the buyer tipped off the authorities, if a naval patrol showed up at the wrong moment, the men selling the cargo had nowhere to hide and no legal protection. This meant that pirates almost always sold their cargo at a significant discount, often somewhere in the range of 30 to 50% below legitimate market value. You were not just selling sugar. You were also buying the silence of everyone involved. And silence was expensive. Port officials expected payments. Tavern keepers expected credit. Ship chandlers who provided rope, tar, timber, fresh water, and salted provisions for the next voyage charged prices that reflected the risk of doing business with wanted men. Every person who touched the money on the way from the ship's hold to the crew's hands took a piece of it. By the time a pirate sat down with his share of a successful raid, the original value of the prize had already been reduced by the assessment discount, the fence's margin, the port fees, and the bribes. Now let's talk about what happened next, because this is the part that explains the fast spending. A sailor who spent months at sea on a crowded, leaking, disease-ridden ship with bad food and worse water had very little interest in long-term financial planning. He had debts, almost certainly. Tavern debts from the last time in port, loans from fellow crew members, unpaid bills from a ship chandler who had fronted him supplies on credit. The moment money arrived, it started flowing out to cover those debts before the man could do much else with it. Then came the spending that was not debt repayment. Food that did not come from a salt barrel. A room that was not a hammock slung between two beams in a dark hold. Boots because footwear wore out fast. Medical attention for wounds that had been treated with whatever was available on board. Rum, ale, wine, because after weeks of rationed water and the occasional cup of sour wine, the demand for something better was not a small thing. This was not irrational behavior. It was the entirely rational response of men who lived inside a system where the future was genuinely uncertain. A pirate had no pension. He had no savings account. He had no land that would hold its value over time. He had no legal business that could grow. When the money might be gone tomorrow through death, capture, or bad luck, the only logical move was to use it today. Spending fast was not stupidity. It was the behavior of people who understood their own situation clearly. But the personal spending alone does not explain the whole picture. The ship also needed to be maintained, and that cost money that came out of the shared fund before any personal spending happened. The teredo worm, a marine organism that bored into wooden planks from below, could compromise a hull faster in tropical waters than in the colder North Atlantic. The solution was careening, running the ship up onto a shallow beach, tilting it onto its side, and scraping and treating the hull with tar and tallow. This had to be done regularly, sometimes every few months in warm water. You needed a secluded beach, out of sight of naval patrols. You needed men healthy enough to do the heavy physical work. You needed guards posted while the ship was vulnerable and lying helpless on its side. And you needed to get it done before provisions ran out. The carpenter's position on a pirate ship was one of the most protected roles on board for exactly this reason. Losing your carpenter in a dispute was a practical catastrophe. A damaged hull with no carpenter to patch it was a ship slowly filling with water, and no amount of stolen cargo changes that math. Rope rotted, sails tore, rigging frayed. Every piece of equipment on a working sailing ship was under constant stress, and every piece that failed had to be replaced. A serious crew's repair and resupply budget could consume a substantial portion of any prize share before the personal spending even began. Men argued constantly about how much to spend on the ship versus how much to distribute among the crew. Spend too little on the ship, and the next voyage might end in a leak that couldn't be stopped. Spend too much, and the crew started asking why their earnings kept disappearing into a vessel they didn't own. Not all prizes were equal, and the difference mattered enormously. Sugar was common in captured prizes from the Caribbean trade routes, but wet sugar spoiled. A hold full of sugar sitting in a humid ship for 2 weeks during a dispute about where to sell it was a hold full of diminishing returns. Tobacco was more durable, but equally bulky. Indigo dye was valuable by weight, but required specific buyers who worked in the textile trade. A pirate crew was not always capturing the most valuable thing available. They were capturing what they could reach on the routes they could patrol, and what a merchant ship happened to be carrying that week. Most of the time, it was another hold full of agricultural products that had to be moved fast before they rotted, or before a naval patrol made the whole transaction impossible. Henry Avery's raid on the Gunj-e-Sawai in 1695 is often cited as one of the greatest pirate hauls in history. The Gunj-e-Sawai was a large Mughal vessel returning from Mecca, and the cargo and treasure it was carrying were reportedly worth somewhere in the range of several £100,000 by the values of the time. The exact figure is disputed, but even by a conservative estimate, it was an extraordinary capture. Avery's crew dispersed to various ports with their shares. They found that having a large amount of suspicious foreign coins and gems was not the same as having usable wealth. Every transaction they attempted carried the risk of recognition and betrayal. Some of Avery's men were caught and hanged in England in 1696. Avery himself disappeared from the historical record entirely. The romantic version says he retired in comfort. The historical record supports a man who had more money than he could safely spend and no infrastructure to handle it. The few documented cases of pirates actually burying treasure are associated with specific, unusual circumstances. Captain William Kidd buried some of his goods on Gardiner's Island in New York in 1699. But this was a pragmatic act by a man already in serious legal trouble, trying to preserve evidence of legitimate privateering, not a romantic act of treasure hiding. He was executed in 1701. The goods were seized by authorities. There was no treasure map, no secret island, and no retirement. The myth of buried treasure may have originated partly in the prosecution stories told at pirate trials. Prosecutors and naval officers sometimes claimed that pirates had vast hidden caches of wealth, partly to justify the expense and effort of hunting them down. The idea that enormous hoards existed somewhere offshore served a narrative purpose for the people building the case against piracy, even if the reality was considerably more dispersed and considerably more mundane. Now, if you had to choose between sailing on a Royal Navy ship or joining a pirate crew for 1 month at sea, which one do you think you'd actually walk away from with more of your money and your health intact? Drop your answer in the comments, because the historical comparison is not as clear as you might expect. Let's look at the Navy side of this, because the contrast sharpens everything. A Royal Navy sailor in the early 1700s received a fixed wage, poorly paid, irregularly distributed, and subject to deductions that could consume a significant portion of his earnings before he ever saw the money. Prize money from captured enemy vessels was heavily tilted toward officers and admirals at the top of the chain of command. An ordinary sailor's share was often small, delayed by years of legal process, and sometimes never paid at all. The Navy also had the right to impress men, meaning it could legally force sailors into service against their will. Desertion from the Royal Navy was common precisely because the conditions and pay were so bad. Many of the men who ended up in pirate crews were former Navy men who had escaped impressment and knew from direct experience exactly how much better the pirate articles were in terms of immediate payment and share of prize. This does not make piracy a better life in any overall sense. A Navy sailor who survived his service could theoretically walk away a free man with a legal identity and some accumulated wages. A pirate who survived was still a wanted criminal who could be hanged if identified and whose wealth was legally forfeit if he was caught. The pirate system offered better immediate returns at the permanent cost of a legal death sentence that never expired. The tension between high short-term payout and no long-term security explains almost everything about pirate spending behavior. The taverns in pirate ports were not accidental gathering places. They were economic engines specifically designed to move money from the crew's pockets into the hands of the people running the port. Rum was cheap to produce in the Caribbean. Selling it at high prices to men who had been at sea for months was not difficult. Gambling happened at every table, and it was not always honest gambling. A man who arrived in port with his prize share could find it gone in 2 days without making a single, obviously catastrophic decision. Some of the pirate articles restricted gambling on board ship during the voyage, not because the articles were morally opposed to it, but because shipboard gambling created debt and resentment between crew members who still had to work together every day. The restriction was practical crew management, not moral philosophy. In port, that restriction was lifted, and the result was predictable every single time. The people who consistently made money in the pirate economy were often not the pirates. Tavern keepers, merchants, ship chandlers, port officials, and middlemen extracted consistent profit from the system. They sold services and goods that pirates absolutely needed at prices that reflected the desperation of the buyers. They took little of the legal risk because they could claim ignorance, cooperate with investigators, or leave port before things got difficult. The pirate was the one who took the physical risk of the raid, the legal risk of carrying stolen goods, and the financial risk of having to sell in a market that was inherently unfavorable. The person taking the primary risk at the sharp end is rarely the person making the most stable long-term profit. This is not a pirate problem. This is how most illegal economies have always worked. The structural problem was this. A pirate who was known to have a large sum of money was attracting attention from every direction at once. Fellow crew members who might want a larger share, port officials who might decide a formal seizure was more profitable than an informal bribe, naval officers who could justify an expensive operation by the promise of recovered plunder. Keeping money moving was, paradoxically, one of the few ways to keep it out of reach of everyone who wanted to take it. And spending was not just temptation. For most men in the pirate life, it was the only financially rational move they had. You cannot buy land under your real name when your real name is on a wanted poster. You cannot open a legitimate business when every transaction you make is a potential record of your criminal history. You cannot deposit money in any institution when that institution is legally obligated to report suspicious funds to the colonial authorities looking for exactly you. The structural conditions of piracy made permanent wealth accumulation nearly unachievable for anyone who stayed in the life. The few pirates who successfully transitioned to legal wealth did so by getting out entirely, accepting a pardon when pardons were available, and investing through third parties in enterprises that could not be traced back to them. This happened occasionally. It was not the norm. The norm was the tavern in Nassau and the empty pockets and the next voyage and the same cycle again until the ship sank The Navy caught you, the crew mutinied, the disease took you, or the gallows finished it.